YAH, please fill me with the Ruach HaKodesh, that I may speak your written words with boldness to those who listen. I ask all these things in Yeshua HaMashiach's name, amen. We'll start with the Shema. Listen and obey. Children of Yah, pay careful attention and respond. Yahweh is our power and authority. Yahweh works in unity with himself, and you shall act upon your love to Yahweh with your power and authority, with your thoughts in mind, with your entire body, and with all the muchness that you have. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. How to deal with the questions you wrote about. Is it good for a man to keep away from women? Well, because of the danger of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give his wife what she is entitled to in the marriage relationship, and the wife should do the same for her husband. The wife is not in charge of her own body, but her husband is. Likewise, the husband is not in charge of his own body, but his wife is. Do not deprive each other except for a limited time, by mutual agreement, and then only so as to have extra time for prayer, but afterwards come together again. Otherwise, because of your lack of self-control, you may succumb to the adversary's temptation. I am giving you this as a suggestion, not as a command. Actually, I wish everyone were like me, but each has his own gift from God, one this, another that. Now to the single people. And the widows, I say that it is fine if they remain unmarried like me. But if they can't exercise self-control, they should get married, because it is better to get married than to keep burning with sexual desire. To those who are married, I have a command. It is not from me, but from the Lord. A woman is not to separate herself from her husband, but if she does separate herself, she is to remain single or be reconciled with her husband. Also, a husband is not to leave his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is satisfied to go on living with him, he should not leave her. Also, if a woman has an unbelieving husband who is satisfied to go on living with her, she is not to leave him. For the unbelieving husband has been set aside for God by the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been set aside for God by the brother. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are set aside for God. But if the unbelieving spouse separates himself, let him be separated. In circumstances like these, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to a life of peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how will you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person live the life the Lord has assigned him, and live it in the condition he was in when God called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the congregations. Was someone already circumcised when he was called? Then he should not try to remove the marks of his circumcision. Was someone uncircumcised when he was called? He shouldn't undergo Brit Milah. Being circumcised means nothing, and being uncircumcised means nothing. What does mean something is keeping God's commands. Each person should remain in the condition he was in when he was called. Were you a slave when you were called? Well, don't let it bother you. Although if you can gain your freedom, take advantage of the opportunity. For a person who was a slave when he was called is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, someone who was a free man when he was called is a slave of the Messiah. You were bought with a price. So do not become slaves of other human beings. Brothers, let each one remain with God in the condition in which he was called. Now the question about the unmarried. I do not have a command from the Lord, but I offer an opinion as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is worthy to be trusted. I suppose that in a time of stress like the present is a good time for a person to stay as he is. That means if man has a wife, he should not seek to be free of her. And if he is unmarried, he should not look for a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin. And if a girl marries, she does not sin. It is just that those who get married will have the normal problems of married life. And I would rather spare you. What I am saying, brothers, is that there is not much time left. From now on, a man with a wife should live as if he had none. And those who are sad should live as if they weren't. Those who are happy as if they weren't. And those who deal in worldly affairs as if not engrossed in them. Because the present scheme of things in this world won't last much longer. What I want is for you to be free of concern. An unmarried man concerns himself with the Lord's affairs, with how to please the Lord. But the married man concerns himself with the world's affairs and how to please his wife, and he finds himself split. Likewise, the woman who is no longer married, or the girl who has never been married, concerns herself with the Lord's affairs, with how to be holy, both physically and spiritually. But the married woman concerns herself with the world's affairs and how to please her husband. I am telling you this for your own benefit, not to put restrictions on you. I am simply concerned that you live in a proper manner and serve the Lord with undivided devotion. Now, if a man thinks he is behaving dishonorably by treating his fiancée this way, and if there is a strong sexual desire so that marriage is what ought to happen, then let him do what he wants. He is not sinning. Let them get married. But if a man has firmly made up his mind, being under no compulsion but having complete control over his will, if he has decided with himself to keep his fiancée a virgin, he will be doing well. So the man who marries his fiancée will do well, and the man who does not marry will do better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, provided he is a believer in the Lord. However, in my opinion, she will be happier if she remains unmarried. And in saying this, I think I have God's Spirit. Let's verify. I don't think he didn't take anything from the Tanakh. Well, how can we learn to love our Creator after reading 1 Corinthians chapter 7? We can learn a lot. Shaul says it is good for each man to have his own wife, and each woman to have her own husband. Each one should give to the other what is entitled in the marriage relationship. Shaul says the wife is not in charge of her own body, but her husband is. Likewise, the husband is not in charge of his own body, but the wife is. Good that we get to pick the spouse. Shaul says, do not deprive each other except for a limited time by mutual agreement, and then only so as to have extra time for prayer. But afterwards, come together again. Shaul says otherwise because of our lack of self-control, we may succumb to the adversary's temptation. Shaul is clear that this is his suggestion, not a command. Shaul wishes that everyone were like him, but knows that each one has a gift from God. Shaul talks now to the single person and the widows. He says it is fine to remain unmarried, like himself, but if one cannot exercise self-control, that they should get married. Shaul says it's better to get married than to keep burning with sexual desire. Shaul does have a command for the married and says this command is from the Lord, our master. A woman is not to separate herself from her husband, but if she does, she is to remain single and be reconciled with her husband. Also, Shaul says to the husband, he is not to leave his wife. To the rest, Shaul says, not the Lord, but Shaul. If a husband who is a follower of Yeshua is married to a woman who is not a follower of Yeshua, but she is satisfied to go on living with him, then he should not leave her. Same concept with the wife and an unbelieving husband. These unbelieving spouses are to set aside for God for what seems like the children. There's something to that. For the children are to be clean. They are to be set aside for God. If the unbelieving spouse separates from the believing spouse, the believer is not enslaved to them. YAH has called us to a life of peace. How will each believer know if they will save the unbeliever? Let each person live the life the Lord is conditioned he was in. So let each person live the life to the Lord in the condition he was in when YAH called them. Trust that according to Shaul, what does mean something? Keeping God's commands. Find out what those are, because we need to be keeping them. Shaul says each person should remain as she was when God called them. Example given, if you were a slave and when you were called, then don't let it bother you. However, if you can gain freedom, take advantage of the opportunity. Shaul says clearly the Lord's chosen people are called a slave of Messiah. Shaul says we were bought with a price. Do not become a slave to another human being. Shaul says again for us to remain with God in the condition in which he or she was called. Shaul says for the unmarried, he does not have a command from the Lord, but Shaul offers an opinion because he can be trusted. If times are stressful, it is good for a person to stay as he is. Example given, if a man has a wife, he should not seek to be free from her, and if he is unmarried, he should not look for a wife. But if we marry, we do not sin. And if a girl marries, she does not sin. Shaul would rather our lives be spared by the normal problems of marriage. Shaul has a perspective of time that is short. Shaul wants us to be free of concern. Example given, an unmarried man concerns himself with the Lord's affairs, with how he can please the Lord. On the other hand, the married man concerns himself with the affairs of the world and how he can please his wife, and he finds himself split. As well as the woman who is no longer married or the girl who has never been married, concerns, that is, consideration, interest, regard, care. So she concerns herself with the Lord's affairs, with how to be holy, that is, set apart both physically and spiritually. But the married woman concerns herself with the world's affairs, with how to please her husband. Trust that Shaul is telling us this for his own benefit, not to put restrictions on us. Shaul is just simply concerned that we live in the proper manner and serve the Lord with undivided devotion. Shaul says clearly, if sexual desire is strong, then marry, and there is no sin in that. The man who has complete control over his will, have you ever met someone like that, and does not marry, he is not sinning either. If a man marries, he will do well, and if a man doesn't marry, he will do better. Very few. A wife is only bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, provided he is a believer in the Lord. Shaul says clearly it is his opinion that she remains single. She'll be happier. And follow up with that, he thinks he has God's Spirit. How can we love others as Yeshua loves us? We can encourage those around us to get married if they are burning with sexual desire. Basically, if they're fornicating, they need to get married. Those who have full control over their bodies, which I know no one like this, needs to remain single. Produce spiritual fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, humility, and self-control. How can we bear one another's burdens? We can show and encourage others to keep YAH's commands. We need to find out what those are. Besides the two, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and being, and love others as you love yourself. I wonder, it seems like there are more than just those two. It seems like we need to be obeying those. We'll end with the Aaronic blessing. Yahweh will kneel before you presenting gifts, and he will guard you with a hedge of protection. Yahweh will illuminate the wholeness of his being toward you, bringing order, and he will provide you with love, sustenance, and friendship. Yahweh will lift up the wholeness of his being and look upon you and will set in place all you need to be whole and complete. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.